In recent months, you've seen a flood of nutritional recommendations urging you to permanently eliminate eggs from your diet, to banish them from your life. Some patients ask, scared, is eating eggs really harming me that much? Am I going to have a heart attack if I keep eating them? Just when we thought we had moved on nutritionally speaking with eggs, yet another controversy arises. What's going on? What's true, what's exaggerated, what's new, and what's just propaganda in all of this? That's what we're going to try to explain in today's video. I'm Dr. Borja Bandera, a medical specialist in endocrinology and nutrition, and today we'll see whether eating eggs has a positive, negative, or neutral effect on your health. First, we need to answer the question, why could eating eggs worsen your health? The main argument is quite simple. Eggs contain a lot of dietary cholesterol, about 180 milligrams per unit in a medium egg, almost all concentrated in the yolk, which would raise cholesterol. Cholesterol is a causal factor in cardiovascular disease, meaning the more cholesterol in your blood, the higher the risk of having cardiovascular disease, such as a heart attack. Up to this point, everything is true. The more low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the more cardiovascular disease in a dose and time-dependent manner. We've known this for decades. There's no controversy. This is something that's totally agreed upon by many different lines of evidence. But new questions arise. To what extent does egg consumption raise low-density lipoprotein cholesterol? How many eggs are we talking about before I should start to worry from the very first one? Is that increase clinically significant? In other words, does the change in my blood test actually create a real risk? That's what today's video is about. One of the most common arguments among those who warn about the hypothetical dangers of eggs is based on substitution studies with plant-based protein sources. If we replace egg consumption with isocaloric doses of plant-based protein sources like legumes, the health of the participants in those studies usually improves. Is this true? It's absolutely true. But then for me, the informative message isn't eggs harm your health, eliminate them completely now. The message would be eggs are a worse choice than plant-based protein sources, which are more protective for your health. Or even better, in a positive way. Your health would benefit slightly if you replaced your egg intake with plant-based protein sources, especially legumes. In this way, we are sending a much more accurate and responsible message in the second case, and now you will understand why. Now I want us to start asking ourselves some questions. First, do you think that as health professionals our approach should be to scare people about eating eggs so that they switch to legumes given that there is a potential benefit? Or is it to inform from a neutral position based on what we see in the studies and appeal to individual responsibility in decision-making? Second question, what percentage of the population will be willing in 2026 to swap their eggs at breakfast for some sautéed chickpeas? Or their French omelette at lunch for textured soy? 3, 5, 7%? Answer me honestly in the comments, I'm interested. Third question, what does the majority of the population eat for breakfast today? Legumes, soy derivatives, seeds? Let me also ask you, would what we usually eat for breakfast as a population generally get worse or better if we replaced it with 2 scrambled eggs and rye bread? We'll discuss this at the end of the video, when I'll share my professional opinion on the topic. I expect I've changed some positions from my earlier videos about eggs. So will my health get worse if I eat eggs? It depends. Yes, basically it depends. I'm sorry, it depends. It's just that in nutrition there are very few absolute answers, and this isn't one of them. We can sum it up like this. In the general population, egg consumption is not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or mortality in most, not all, but most studies. But things change in some specific subgroups. That is, eggs don't affect everyone the same way. I'll try to explain it because it's complex. The same egg consumption can have a positive, neutral, or negative long-term effect on different people. Let's take adding 3 eggs to the diet as an example. In a man with a body mass index of 41 who already has a croissant with juice and coffee with sugar for breakfast. Changing this for 3 scrambled eggs with whole wheat bread and tomato, it will generate a clear metabolic benefit, which far outweighs the possible or expected moderate increase in low-density lipoprotein. In an elderly person over 75 years old with low caloric and protein intake due to dental problems, who is already frail, who has white bread toast with butter and 2 Maria cookies for breakfast, something very common. Adding 3 eggs generates an absolute benefit far greater than the possible slight increase in low-density lipoprotein that may occur. However, what happens? Well, in a patient with a low-density lipoprotein already at 180 or with familial hypercholesterolemia, clinically adding 3 eggs is much more significant, and in this case, the effect would be much more negative. The same goes for a person with already established cardiovascular disease or someone who is genetically very responsive to dietary cholesterol and also has other cardiovascular risk factors like high blood pressure. So, as you can see, we can't just say that eating eggs will make you sick because that's not a message without consequences. If we can't do that with an ice cream or a cream pastry because that's not the case, just imagine with an unprocessed food, neutral or even beneficial in many contexts like eggs. We can't lose our minds over nutrition, guys. So Borja, what factors determine whether eggs have a negative impact on my health or not? Well, look, there are many factors and this is very interesting. First, your baseline cholesterol intake. This is one of the main factors that changes the impact. If you start with a diet that already includes a lot of cholesterol, most current diets, unfortunately, due to adaptation mechanisms, the impact of the cholesterol from eggs on your blood cholesterol will be small. And this is what most studies see. And that's why many of the conclusions were, and in my day, mine was too, that dietary cholesterol hardly raises serum cholesterol at all. However, this needs to be clarified, and in this video today, I'm going to clarify it. It's one of the things I've changed regarding my message about eggs. In the trials, the dose-response relationship between dietary cholesterol and serum low-density lipoprotein, it is modeled with curves that are not linear. They are non-linear curves like Michaelis-Menten, not with a linear curve, where increased dietary cholesterol always leads to higher blood cholesterol. What does this mean? Well, it means that when you already consume enough dietary cholesterol, your body adapts and the incremental increase in serum cholesterol becomes smaller and smaller. How does your body adapt when you already consume enough dietary cholesterol? Well, it reduces absorption in the intestine, reduces the synthesis of low-density lipoprotein in the liver, increases bile excretion, which you eliminate through digestion. And of course, this doesn't invalidate a very interesting point, which is that if that person who already consumes a lot of dietary cholesterol stopped consuming it, including stopping eating eggs, they would see a considerable improvement in their low-density lipoprotein cholesterol in a short time. Let's say, to see if it's clear that if you're already doing things wrong, a moderate consumption of eggs won't add too much fuel to the fire, and you still have a lot of room for improvement ahead. But of course, this doesn't justify the act or make you stop eating eggs just because your low-density lipoprotein won't go up much more. In fact, for me, there are two ways to look at it. If you're not willing to reduce your dietary cholesterol intake, eating 1 or 2 eggs a day has almost no additional impact. But if you are willing, your potential for improvement in low-density lipoprotein is quite high. And for me, you can be willing in 2 ways. By adopting a vegan diet or by adopting a plant-based diet, but without completely eliminating animal products. Obviously, I think if you follow me, you know that I lean more toward this second option without having anything at all against 100% plant-based diets. Even so, the evidence points to saturated fat having more effects on low-density lipoprotein than the dietary cholesterol from eggs. Also, the presence or absence of fiber in the diet, which is a much less mentioned point because fiber removes cholesterol through the digestive tract. In fact, if you remove the egg but leave the butter, red meat, processed meat, dairy, and so on, the effect you're going to get will be very small. Previous comorbidities are another influential factor, as I mentioned earlier. Those who already have previous dyslipidemia, extra cardiovascular risk factors, and especially those who have already had cardiovascular disease. In other words, we're talking about secondary prevention. Yes. They benefit more from removing or reducing the consumption of eggs and other sources of dietary cholesterol. This isn't new either. This has already been mentioned in the studies. If you already have high low-density lipoprotein, if you have cardiovascular disease, be careful with high egg consumption. It might seem counterintuitive, but the higher your baseline low-density lipoprotein, the greater the effect for the same increase in dietary cholesterol. Some models predict a greater increase in low-density lipoprotein, which goes a bit against the previous message. But that's how it is. What determines this is absorption genetics. Intestinal absorption varies a lot from person to person due to differences in the genes involved. That's it. This is often used both for and against eggs. Someone might show their test results after eating 15 eggs. I've had 15 eggs for breakfast and then I get my blood work done to prove that my low-density lipoprotein barely went up, to validate the idea that dietary cholesterol doesn't raise serum cholesterol in blood tests. That's false. It does raise it, but someone else might do the opposite. I ate 10 eggs and my cholesterol went from 100 to 140. Both could be right, but there are significant genetic differences and a lot of inter-individual variability. In the same way, there are genetic variants that affect intestinal flow or how much low-density lipoprotein you clear through the intestinal pathway. So, the same intake affects two people differently, and that's why you have to evaluate the lipid profile with lab tests, and that's why personalized nutrition is necessary. This point is one of the major modulators of risk. Eggs come into your diet to either improve it or make it worse, because people don't just add eggs to their diet and that's it. Normally, we add one food and remove another. We substitute. We don't just add something out of nowhere. If eggs replace ultra-processed foods and sources of simple sugars, which happens very often, then they're improving your diet. Keep that in mind. If it replaces your plate of lentils with vegetables, then it's probably making it worse, but even in that context, it's unfair to say that eggs are bad in absolute terms. What's happening here is that legumes and vegetables are more protective in our current context. Probably for someone with protein malnutrition in a village in sub-Saharan Africa, both dishes would be a blessing, because cardiovascular risk would be the least of that individual's concerns in the short term, someone who would have no cardiovascular risk factors but who is dying of hunger. But in our dietary and social context of abundance, what provides more fiber, micronutrients, less caloric density, and more satiety is going to come out on top. Let's understand the context, not good or bad foods. Burn that phrase into your mind. Also, how you consume the egg, the how has always mattered a lot. In a Mediterranean context, it's common for the egg to be consumed with extra virgin olive oil, with vegetables, with legumes, with whole grain bread. It's not always the case, but it's common to see scrambled eggs with a slice of sourdough bread for breakfast, ratatouille with zucchini, eggplant, tomato, and pepper. With a grilled egg, or adding a whole egg to a salad as a protein source, or adding a poached egg to vegetable soup for dinner, or a French omelette and a piece of fruit for lunch, which is very different from eggs with bacon and sausages. The English breakfast, or fried eggs in plenty of oil with French fries, a star dish in Andalusia, or a tortilla sandwich with white bread for lunch, for example. Or the keto pattern, carnivorous with eggs, butter, bacon, and a complete absence of vegetables. They are not two very different situations. And finally, the number, the quantity, the dose, the number of eggs or yolks consumed per week has a big impact. The studies that show an increase in cardiovascular risk do so with a consumption of at least one more egg per day or more than 7 per week. And even so, the magnitude of the effect found is quite small, and that association depends on other dietary factors and lifestyle. If we look at dose-response models of dietary cholesterol, like this meta-regression of 55 studies, we see that for every increase of 100 milligrams per day of dietary cholesterol, there is an increase, I repeat, in this study of low-density lipoprotein of between plus 1.9 milligrams per deciliter and plus 4.5 milligrams per. For 2 medium eggs a day, this could translate into a range that could, roughly speaking, vary between 7 and 17 extra milligrams per day. In practice, in the real population, which is already omnivorous and generally includes abundant dietary cholesterol intake, we would usually stay in the low to middle range of that bracket for the adaptation reasons I mentioned earlier. That is, if every day of your life you suddenly started eating 2 more medium eggs and everything else stayed the same, it usually doesn't happen that way. I repeat, we usually substitute one thing for another. Your low-density lipoprotein could maybe go from 110 to 115 or 120 in the worst case. This means the effect is small and highly variable. Some people won't see an increase, while others might see a bigger one. Now I'm asking you, viewer, I don't care if you're a nutritionist or not in this case, does this increase justify a crusade against eggs? I'll leave it for you to simply think about. What it does justify, though, is not exaggerating the qualities of eggs, not evangelizing them, and not encouraging people to eat as many eggs as possible. This happens with any other food, not just eggs. It doesn't matter if it's carrots, not ignoring everything we're talking about in this video, or not keeping ourselves updated. None of that is justified, but any professional with common sense would do that. There's no need to bash eggs for that. Alright, key and difficult question. How much would this increase in low-density lipoprotein raise cardiovascular risk? I repeat, it's a very difficult question. The best tool we have to answer this are pharmacological and genetic studies, basically statin studies, in which for every 39 milligrams per deciliter less of low-density lipoprotein, it is associated in this one, which is one of the best, with a 20 to 25% fewer cardiovascular events, a considerable risk reduction. If we hypothetically translate studies on statins to studies with eggs, then adding 2 eggs a day would increase the risk of cardiovascular events by about 5 or 6%. And even after all that math and those assumptions, it's a completely mechanistic conclusion. Your final cardiovascular risk will depend on what you eat with the egg, what you eat if you don't eat eggs, how hard it is for you not to eat eggs, how you cook the eggs, and countless individual factors that are impossible to cover. We can't fall into the ecological fallacy of confusing average effects with individual effects, because you are not the average of a clinical trial. You are a person whose complexity is impossible to encompass and who will never be fully represented by the result of a study. My professional opinion here, let me repeat, professional opinion and also personal. It's worth emphasizing that those of you who have followed me from the beginning know well that I can't be boxed into any one diet. I'm not a doctor who's anti or pro anything. I'm not a keto doctor, I'm not a vegan doctor, I'm not even a Mediterranean doctor, nothing like that. I'm a supporter of evidence, and it's not hard for me to change my mind either. So much so that regarding eggs, I've changed my mind on some aspects, and I hope to change my mind on many other topics as well. Why? Because that will mean I'm not intellectually dead, that I still enjoy and learn from science. That said, what I don't like, and I'll say it clearly, I don't like fanatic positions where people instill scientifically unjustified fear in the general public to gain attention, views, to monetize, etc. It's very common. Second, people try to force the population to follow a specific nutritional approach, also using fear as the main tool. Or third, people try to defend an ideology at all costs, no matter how commendable, positive, or good it is, using science as a weapon. I don't like that either. The first point creates confusion, bad decisions, and distrust among the public. And today, eggs are not a nutritional threat as some people make it seem. Eggs are not a problem. We have many problems. There are 3,000 threats much more concerning than eggs, just on a nutritional level. And nutrition is just one aspect of health, not even the most important one for me. That being said, for most people, a moderate egg intake, let's say 1 to 5 eggs a week, won't noticeably worsen overall or cardiovascular health, according to the bulk of the evidence. Alright, in several population subgroups, egg consumption will have a greater negative impact. Previous cardiovascular disease, several established cardiovascular risk factors, including previous hypercholesterolemia, and little or no previous dietary cholesterol intake. A vegan-vegetarian pattern, high daily consumption that displaces other protective foods, in other words, eating 10, 15, 20, or even 25 eggs a week. Eggs, in most healthy adults, improve nutritional quality, satiety index, and body composition for the reasons previously mentioned. What's more, even if we look at it from a purely ecological perspective, the environmental impact of eggs is much lower compared to other sources of animal protein. And the egg industry is neither more nor less powerful than other industries. The recommendation is still to follow a plant-based diet, always within a framework of possible adherence, which is very individual. Most of the population, and those of us who are clinicians and see patients know this, is not prepared or willing to follow a predominantly plant-based diet, much less a 100% plant-based diet, despite evidence indicating a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Although the theoretical optimum for physical exercise is to combine strength, high-intensity interval training zone 2 and mobility, most people only aspire to do a little exercise, enjoy it, and do it when life allows, and that's it. Although it's ideal to sleep 8 to 9 hours consistently, most people get only about 6.5 hours. And although the diet that seems to reduce cardiovascular risk the most, with evidence on the table, is a 100% plant-based diet, most people can't follow a vegan diet, no matter how hard it is to understand. I'm sorry. Nutrition is imperfect because humans are imperfect, and since we deal with people, we have to adapt to them. That means that sometimes the recommendations aren't perfect, but only slightly improve the decisions the patient is already making. The reduction achieved in low-density lipoprotein by going from eating 4 eggs a week to eating none has no benefit. If that abstinence from eggs is unsustainable for you, or even worse, leads you to replace eggs with something that increases your cardiovascular risk even more, like white bread with jam, for example, we would see it much more clearly if we compared it with the famous statins. If a patient manages to lower their low-density lipoprotein with high doses of rosuvastatin to, let's say, 70 milligrams per deciliter of low-density lipoprotein, optimal levels, really good, I wish we all had them there. But the myalgias associated with statins make him stop exercising, become sedentary, and his metabolic health gets much worse. Statins, let me ask you, have they improved or worsened his health? This is what I mean by a cholesterol-centric attitude, okay? I always say that getting a metabolic patient to drink 2 liters of zero-calorie cola is a success if before coming to the appointment he was drinking 2 liters of regular sugary cola. Communication strategies based on demonizing foods and creating fear only lead to rigid behavior patterns that are far from healthy and sustainable habits. It's important to understand that these approaches don't align with people's clinical reality. To do that, you must see and care for patients, understanding their realities, which often differ from ours since we have the privilege of self-care. If cardiovascular disease is multifactorial, just imagine your overall health. What I've learned since I started studying medicine 16 years ago is that focusing too much on a single factor makes us miss the rest, without invalidating the true and widely accepted scientific messages that we keep learning. So, to sum up my position, which I hope helps you, yes, eggs increase low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, mainly the yolk. No, it doesn't increase it equally in all individuals, and in many people it doesn't change the lipid profile or can even improve it. It all depends on the starting point of the individual's genetics, health, and diet. The potential benefit of stopping egg consumption is therefore very variable from person to person, but it's never significant. It's not comparable, for example, to doing 30 minutes of aerobic exercise a day. In most of the Western population, realistically, eggs don't make the diet worse and in many cases can improve it from a cholesterol-centered point of view. What happens is that the previous point is blind, you can't see it. If you only focus on cholesterol, you can't see it. Egg consumption of up to 7 per week, 1 a day in most studies, has a minimal or no effect on overall and cardiovascular health. Now, if you decide to eliminate eggs from your life while keeping other sources of dietary cholesterol like meats, dairy, etc., the reduction in low-density lipoprotein will be rather poor. That is, if you really want to see changes. For dietary low-density lipoprotein, either you go vegan or you greatly reduce your consumption of animal products. If you decide to stop eating animal products and go vegan, your low-density lipoprotein will indeed drop a lot, most likely below 100. Will you have improved? It's one of the many cardiovascular risk factors that exist, and this is very important. We can't force a vegan diet on the population. This is a perfectly respectable personal decision, but in the world we live in, to carry out. If you are able to do it and maintain it over time, I sincerely congratulate you. Honestly, this isn't science, but if egg consumption invariably caused cardiovascular disease, as a certain editorial line of content creators seems to claim, the magnitude of the effect found would be greater. Like what happens with tobacco, as we're starting to see with vaping, or as we've seen for a long time with obesity, but we're facing a very different scenario. Which leads me to conclude what the bulk of the evidence concludes: most of the healthy population studied. Adding a moderate consumption of eggs doesn't change the risk too much, but it would increase it. For example, if vegans suddenly started eating 4 or 5 eggs a day, or switched to a keto or carnivore diet. I'd like to see that kind of shift compared, but I haven't found one and don't think it exists. Even in this difficult assumption, the worsening wouldn't be caused only by the egg. I'm wrapping up. I hope this video, made with the utmost respect for any dietary approach, can clear up some of your doubts. Far from trying to confront or polarize creators or viewers, since we're already quite polarized, sadly the only thing I'm trying to do is share my perspective, which is based not only on clinical or preclinical studies, but also, and for me this is more important, from working with people who suffer, who live in the real world and have everyday problems, and they share them with me. See you in the next video, a big hug, and let's keep empowering each other.